Morning folks, as Amanda said, I'm Barf. I am the Safety and Surface Technician here at the museum, and part of that trade is aircraft finishing, which is all the aircraft painting. I joined the aircraft painting trade as my junior course for the Safety and Surface trade back in 1982, somewhere around there. At that stage we were closer to World War II than we are today to when I joined up. So I've got a few years experience behind me. I've painted plenty of aeroplanes over the years, and part of my job here at the museum is to keep track of all our aircraft markings, historical and stuff that's coming in as well. So I've got a fair amount of knowledge. I've got mountains of research material over in my office, and I'm trying to impart some of that to you today. I hope I won't bore you, and I'll try and keep it interesting. If I see anyone yawning, I'll try and speed it up for you. We've got some hecklers up the back, fellow trade members, Trudy there, so she'll keep me honest. If I'm starting to spin the bull dust, she'll probably stand up and sing out. So we'll do questions and answers near the end, at the end. If there's an urgent one halfway through, I'll kind of just keep going, impart that a little bit as relevant to that part of the conversation. So here we go. We'll start off with, can you see me? The history of aircraft markings. So there is quite a long history. They go way, way back, and we'll cover that. First up though, why do we need aircraft markings? Basically it's so you can be seen, but it's more to the point, there are legal, there are actual legalities of international law behind aircraft markings. So we will cover those a bit, but Dr. Maciej Piekowski, University of Lodz, had this to say: the duty to distinguish oneself from non-combatants and civilians, e.g. by wearing a uniform or distinctive emblem, is a characteristic of every domain of warfare, including the aerial environment. So that's the kind of a nice legalese type thing, and it was mainly so you can be identified as a belligerent if you're a military aircraft. The other side of that is you didn't want to be shot at by your own side. So one of the big reasons that they started using aerial markings on aircraft was simply, I would rather not be shot at by my own side. So that was one of the biggest reasons at the start. There was a lot of aeroplanes flying around. This is leading up to World War I. A lot of airplanes flying around. Nobody knew who each other was, so they were simply just shooting at anyone. And that's a problem that carries on right throughout the history of military aviation. So military aviation started quite early. We go back to the year 647. Korean General Kim Il-sung had this bright idea of using flaming kites to both rally his troops and scare the bejesus out of the enemy. So that's one of the earliest documented uses of an aerial device in warfare. In the Song dynasty, they developed the fire crow incendiary kite. So they had these large kites with bombs attached to them. They would fly them over the enemy lines, cut them loose, and cause all sorts of havoc with fires and things like that. So it goes back quite a way. But there was kind of a big gap between what the Chinese were doing and over to Europe. Now the Napoleonic Wars, around 1794, that's when the Napoleonic Wars were on, and they were using observation balloons to spot the enemy so they could adjust their tactics to suit. And the French had so many of these balloons that they decided they would create the French Aerostatic Corps, or the Company of Aeronauts. So they weren't too concerned about markings at that stage, because it was fairly easy to see who was who, because you just followed the big string that went back to the ground and the person holding that balloon, so you knew which side they were on. So often they would just give their favourite balloon a personal name. But that's when it all really kicked off for proper military aviation as such. So then we get to 1901, where we've been through all those wars. They're still using observation balloons. They're developing zeppelins and things like that. Not true aeroplanes and aerial warfare that we're used to, you know, with your dogfights and World War II, things like that. So French jurist Paul Fauchel, in his article entitled Le domaine aérien et le régime juridique des aérostats, he was an aviation law expert, and he presented a breakdown of ideas on the legal status of air domain, and he championed the idea of freedom of the air. Following the customary law of the sea, he claimed that the status of airspace should be analogical to the high seas, which makes perfect sense. So at this stage they had the laws of naval warfare and land warfare. So he was just building on that. In 1902, he presented a detailed report on the current legal framework of the aerial domain. It's all very legalese. And he stated, public, military included, or private aircraft should present external markings, which would allow for swift visual identification of the nationality of the aircraft. He underlined that stateless aircraft could be compared to pirate vessels and treated accordingly, as is the law of the sea. Now this actually carries right through to the present day, where the laws that they came up with at the time didn't cover things like aerial drones, your unmanned aircraft that are in common use today. So there's a really legal grey area when it comes to the modern drone warfare. And by the letter of the law, they don't actually have to have a national marking on them. And it has been done that some of the aerial drones they're using are not nationally marked. 1911, during the International Law Institute, he proposed the Code of Law for Aerial Warfare, and it underlined that only military aircraft are entitled to belligerent rights. So civilian aeroplanes cannot be used to bomb people or shoot at people. So that's all tied up with the military aircraft that were starting to come in. It was firmly highlighted that the aircraft need to carry clearly distinctive invisible markings. So we can see where this is headed. 1914, James Maloney Spate was a British lawyer and pilot, and he was a prolific aviation writer. He wrote books right up into World War II. There's some very interesting reading if you're a bit like me, probably very dull reading if you're not interested in the aircraft markings. But he came up with this definition of military aircraft. So he stipulated that the aircraft should, 1, operate under military jurisdiction, so be part of a organised armed service, display the national insignia, and be manned by aircrew subjected to military discipline and respecting those laws of war. So Spate also went on with a lot more stuff, but minimal additions to that military aircraft. That went into the Hague Rules of Air Warfare, and they still sort of convene what we actually do today in military aviation. So the crew of a military aircraft should be distinguishable as soldiers. So if you're not wearing a uniform and you're flying a military aeroplane, that comes into those he's a spy things. So you lose those belligerent rights, and you lose the customary rights that you're awarded under the Geneva Convention, things like that. So a distinctive mark that is removable at will is quite insufficient. So if you could just, you Velcro a patch on and then take it off at the end of the day and go and pretend you're someone else, change your markings, things like that. Now that, it might seem a little bit silly, but I have actually seen a C-130 Hercules, which belonged to the Americans. We're pretty sure it did not belong to the US Air Force. It was definitely CIA. The markings that were on that aircraft, including the stars and bars, and the serial number of the aeroplane, were simply riveted onto the side on a separate aluminium panel. So the aircraft was very, very dodgy, and that sort of stuff is still carrying on. Someone traced that aircraft serial number and found out that was from a C-130 that was destroyed in a fire about 7 years earlier. So not everyone's playing by the rules all the time. 1912. Now this is when military markings really kicked off. Once again, it was the French, because they had an organised, a way more organised system than anyone else. And on the 29th of March 2012, they adopted a bill and created French military aviation. So they're one of the first, if not the first, recognised military air service. On the 26th of July, they passed an amendment with an order to paint any French military aircraft with a specified and distinctive three-coloured roundel. So they were the first people to use roundels, and it took off. It became quite popular. The roundel design was based on why? Well, why roundels? Why did they come up with that design? What was the choice? They had a choice of many other things. Why a circle? Why paint a bullseye on the side of the aircraft? So it sort of goes back to this chappie, Emperor Napoleon, and he is quite a fan of these, the cockade. Now that became a symbol of the French Revolution, these ribbons formed into a circle, and they simply took that design with the French flag colours and turned it into the first roundel. So that's where that all stems from. By this stage we're pushing into the First World War. Oh, hang on, just back up a bit. Essentials of markings. This is what they needed to convey on every aircraft. Identification of nationality, roundels and or other symbols. So there was squares, there was crosses, diamonds, triangles, you name it. There was all sorts of different markings. The roundel sort of is the much more common one, but if you start looking into what's out there, there are a lot of rather odd-shaped national markings on aeroplanes. Stars got very popular, especially with the communist nations. So those markings had to be visible from any angle. So you couldn't just have them on one side of the aircraft or on the top. It had to be seen from everywhere. On the top, you could be seen by people flying above you, be it your own side or the enemy. Especially from the ground is where you want it to be visible, so your own troops weren't shooting at you from the ground. And the aircraft had to have a serial number on it to identify the particular aircraft. So there we go, we've got a French Newport 1912. We've got our great big roundels on the wings. Oddly on this, it's both sides of the wings, top and bottom of each wing, rather than just the top of the top one and the bottom of the bottom one, which became more common. So they've got one down below, so your own troops aren't shooting at you. And down the back we've got a fin flash and a serial number. So the fin flash, obviously to the French, looks fairly familiar. That's their national flag simply plastered onto the tail of the aircraft. So that became their sort of common places and items that they wanted marked on all their aeroplanes. So the fin flash, this is a question that comes up quite often, especially with our aircraft out there. Why have we got a French flag on our aeroplanes? The blue is always at the front, and that's the way they looked at their flags. So it's always at the front, so on the other side, the forward portion of the rudder has that blue portion. And I've got their roundel on the side there. In 1914, the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service, later to become the RAF, they kept that French fin flash. They had their own roundel, they developed that, and more about that shortly, but they simply just reversed the colours of the French, and then they kept their serial numbers on the back of the aircraft as well. Once again, blue facing forward. Then the Germans joined in 1913, and initially their marking was simply a big black rectangle or square that went right across the top of the wing or wing chord. So it was a fairly basic one, but reasonably easy to spot, but possibly got lost in low light conditions, so they added the iron cross onto their markings. That's 1914-15. Then they changed that in 15 to 17. They used this version of the iron cross. And then at the end of the war, they went to this. This is the beam cross, or Balkenkreuz, and that became pretty much their standard marking from there on. They've refined it a wee bit, and by 1918 they'd come up with this one. The thing is, during this time, there was not a lot of standardisation. The markings were simply promulgated. We want you to put a big black cross on top of the wings. They didn't actually supply any measurements, so there's a huge variation on the widths and sizes of these things. So you see on this Fokker D7 there, we've got our 2 crosses on the top of the wings there. We've got an aircraft serial number down there, not on the rudder for some reason. The Germans preferred it down on the side there. But we've also got this personalised marking in the place of any sort of roundel on the side. And World War I was sort of a... there was some very flamboyant characters in the pilot corps there, and so they came up with all sorts of things. This is an Albatross replica, and those are the colours that they used during von Richthofen's flying circus. So they became very flamboyant. They had their own personal markings. The big star on the side was a personal choice. The colours of the aeroplanes became very, very vibrant. But you've still got your markings top and bottom of the wings, on the fuselage and on the tail. Then the British joined in 1914. Took them a while to get their act together. They started off by simply putting a Union Jack on their aircraft. That looked too much like a cross. So it was easily confused with the German aircraft from the ground, so they were being shot at by their own side quite a bit. So they decided they'd come up with their own roundels. So they reversed those French colours and came up with the common RAF roundel that we see today. At that stage, the Royal Naval Air Service had their own roundel. They had a red circle with a white centre. That's pretty much the exact same markings as the Denmark Air Force. So later in 1914, in December, they combined them, all the services, all under the same roundel. So that just became a lot easier to identify friend from foe. So here's some examples. There's the early RNAS in 1914. You've got your big Union Jacks down the side. Yes, it's in black and white, but they do look a lot like the German beam crosses. You notice each aircraft's got its own serial number, but only the one at the front here has a fin flash at this stage. We've got another one there with just the cross on the tail. Once again, so much like the Germans, it's moderately dangerous for them. Some pilots decided to hedge their bets. They'd later have the roundel and the cross under the wings. So it was a bit of a wild west of put any marking on that you felt safe with. So, and then we've got things like the FE2 here. You can't put a roundel on the fuselage. There's nothing to put it on. So these later ended up with a small roundel on the forward fuselage, much like modern aeroplanes. But it's still got its serial number and its great big fin flash on the back. You also had different squadrons with their own identities. So the most famous course being Richthofen's flying circus, the red aeroplanes, but once again you've still got all your markings in the required places. Very flamboyant. So that's the sort of flight you'd see in the flying circus. All individualised colours, and the red cowlings and wheel coverings that donated. It was part of the flying circus, so that red colour became their sort of go-to for identifying the unit, whilst they were still having all these very colourful personalised markings. The British kept it simple. Being the British stiff upper lip, individuality and flamboyance was kind of frowned upon. So they allowed the squadrons to have their own individual marking in the form of a stripe somewhere on the aircraft. So some of them are a double stripe, some are a straight up and down, a V shape or whatever. That identified your individual squadron, which allowed, after a massive dogfight, there'd be aircraft all over the sky. You wanted to reunite yourself with your squadron mates and head back to your airfield, so you'd go looking for those white stripes to identify your particular squadron. I also had flight ID colours, so that would be red flight, which was often a flight of a particular squadron, so they changed those colours so they could form up if those flights were at different parts of the airfields. They did allow some minor personal markings, so there's plenty of these Sopwith pups with individual names on them. You still see down the back it's got its serial number, and it even has the builders' names on the tail fin. So this one, very famous French squadron, the Lafayette Escadrille, and this was staffed by American pilots, volunteer American pilots. So it's French air service flown by Americans, and they brought their own personalised marking to the fuselage, which was their native Indian head. So there was just a massive amount of individualisation between these squadrons in those days. It still carries through. Between the wars, by that stage, those markings had been standardised. So the British had their roundels, but they still wanted to identify their squadrons. So they ended up with these squadron flashes. Us, on the other hand, that's our aircraft out in the hall, we didn't get quite as flamboyant, probably because we didn't have as many squadrons. So we went with flight markings. So the A3 and the red stripes on this is from a flight operating out of here at Wigram. So there was a B flight had blue markings on it. So we kept it fairly simple, but the Brits, they were having a ball. This is a Naval Air Service Hawker Nimrod with the diamonds right down the top of the wing, giant stripes and yellow colours everywhere. So there was dozens of these squadrons all competing against each other to see who could have the brightest aircraft. That brought us up to World War II, and that's where things really kick off in this respect. We had the big five. We've got the Brits, the Germans, the Japanese, the Russians, and the Americans. Now the Japanese and the Russians sort of stayed pretty much true to their first up markings there. They kept the rising sun and the communist star, and they didn't change very much. There was a few minor variations. But the other three, they had a great time sort of changing things up a wee bit. So the RAF at the start of World War II had the Type A1 roundel, which is the red, white and blue, and then a big yellow ring around the outside. And at that stage it was that kind of leading into the war, almost the Cold War period, the false war, where they wanted the aircraft to be easily seen from the sides. So they put the big yellow circle around the outside, and that on things like Spitfires was as big as the fuselage. They couldn't get them any bigger. They ran out of aeroplane to paint it on. But later they thought, that's a little bit silly. We'll trim it back a wee bit. We'll make that yellow a little bit skinnier. And then too much white showing, so we'll just make the red a wee bit bigger. And that's pretty much the roundel they ended up with at the end of World War II. This is Europe. Things changed a bit in the other places. On tops of their wings they had the simple blue and white, which was almost a low-vis marking by those standards. They had the wide white on their initial fin flashes, and then went to a skinnier white just to cut down on the overall, here I am, come and shoot at me sort of idea. In other theatres, this is Southeast Asia Command and the CBI, that's China, Burma, India Theatre. They took the red out. That was simply because the red markings on the Japanese aircraft they were fighting against was too easily recognisable. So they took the red out to, once again, that friend or foe, don't want to be shot at by your own side thing. And then they simplified the roundel to suit the fin flash, sorry. So the white portion, the light blue portion on those was always to the front of the aircraft. When they started operating in the Pacific, with the Pacific Fleet and around East Asia, this is Fleet Air Arm, they simply went with the overpainted American style. So that meant that the Americans wouldn't shoot at them, because by this stage Pearl Harbor had made the American Navy quite titchy, so they were prone to shoot at anything that had a red dot on it and wasn't easily identifiable. So if you're a colourblind gunner on a ship and couldn't tell the difference between red and blue, these pilots were in fairly high danger from friendly fire. So the US markings at the start of World War II, they had their star with a nice big red circle in it. They adopted that in 1919 and it carried right through to 1942. Then of course there's Pearl Harbor and Midway and things like that, so they also had a very, very bright rudder. But once again, shot at too often, so they just took the red out of their roundel. Later on, they would then adopt this one. So they put the bars on the side to make it more recognisable to their somewhat touchy navy gunners, and they put a red border around it. That lasted a whole month. They decided that the red was still going to be an issue for them, so they simplified it pretty much to what we have today with the American forces. The only change there, after that, they put a red stripe through the middle of the white bars. But that's pretty much what they ended up with for the rest of World War II, 1943 onwards. German markings, on the other hand, are a little bit more simple, but they had three different sorts on each aircraft. So you had the wings with the wide black cross, the fuselage had the narrow black, and then the tailplane had their infamous swastika. But this is where, I think it's mainly because they were losing, they started to think high visibility is probably not a great thing. We want to be a little bit more sneaky because we're running out of pilots. So they actually adopted a more low-vis version of their national markings in both black and white. So against the grey of those aircraft, you can see the contrast between that black dropping off. So that's pretty much where the low-vis markings that we know today originated from. RNZAF markings. Well, in World War II, we simply followed everything the Brits did. It was much simpler. We were part of the empire, so at the other end of the world, we were simply doing what they did. Once we got involved in the Pacific War, of course, things became a bit more of a problem with those big red dots. So they shrunk the red down to a little 2-inch in the middle of it. And that wasn't quite good enough. They went, it's still a bit too much red on that. We'll go down to a tiny little dot in the middle. And then things started to change up quite a bit. We had small white and a larger red. Then they got rid of the red altogether and went for a blue-white-blue roundel. So that got over that problem of the American services and itchy fingered gunners. They also had them without the yellow. On all of these are the fuselage roundels. On wings, they didn't have the yellow circles. And eventually, we also adopted the American-style bars. So because we are operating in the Pacific, we are operating under American control, so they told us where and when they wanted the various squadrons. So they simply went with what the Americans liked the most. So we've got some samples there. There's 14 Squadron at home in New Zealand with their big red, white and blue roundels. You'll see the contrast here. You've got a blue, white, blue on the middle aircraft on the wing, and on this near one is simply the British blue and red. So you've got this combination of markings. So that was basically a case of when they were changing these markings, they didn't have the time or the manpower to paint everything at once. Our painting trade didn't actually exist in those days. So there was simply whoever was handy with a brush got to do the painting at the time. No formal training. There's one with the tiny red dot in the middle of the roundel. That's the Tongan P-40s up in the islands. That's an interesting one. That's a blue, white, blue, and they've simply painted the big blue circle and stenciled the white onto it. There are dozens of variations of these things, absolutely dozens. That's a Corsair with the very last type of marking we used up in the islands, the blue, white, blue, yellow around the outside on the fuselage and the American bars. Often they would just paint straight over the American markings when the aircraft arrived as part of the Lend-Lease program. Sometime earlier on they didn't have those and they would paint the bars on. So the bars, they wanted bars on the aircraft, but no one really specified how these things should be marked, what sizes they should be. And Warren Russell, who's a very great paint scheme researcher, he has identified just under 50 different types of bar and roundel on the Corsair aircraft alone. So standardisation, as long as it roughly looked like what you wanted, they were quite happy with it. And it's got the very narrow fin flash on the back. So we shrunk our fin flashes down to about a 4-inch. So by that stage, this is the back end of World War II in the Pacific. So things could be brighter without worrying too much about the enemy. But in some cases, it still wasn't conspicuous enough. Operating with the Americans, they had hundreds, thousands of aircraft in the Pacific theatre, and we needed to be seen. And as the threat of the Japanese Air Force and Navy aircraft became less, they decided to get a bit bolder and make those recognition markings a little bit easier. So we ended up with things like this. We've got white stripes all over the place. We've got a white tail. We've got American star bar type markings. How we got to that was over a period of time during the operations in the Pacific, specifically with the Kitty Hawks, that they started with a all over either camouflage pattern or olive drab all over scheme like this, and then the Americans said, look, we're still having trouble. You know, the big white spinner that we've started with, not quite enough. We'll put a white stripe over this, and that'll make it a bit more recognisable. And then a month or so later, they went, no, that's not enough. We're still having trouble, so we'll add another stripe to after the fuselage. A month later, still not enough. We're going to add big stripes, top and bottom of the wings. We're going to have a stripe on the tail. So they're really, really becoming easy to see now. Still not enough. So they ended up with this. This is the final paint scheme of the Kitty Hawks up there. You've got the American style bars on your roundels. You've got those big white stripes, and they painted the whole tail white. So by this stage, all the American fighter aircraft in theatre, all the Australian ones, all operating under the auspices of the US command, all had a scheme like this. So the white tails were on all these different aircraft, be it P-39 Aerocobras and things like that. So that's what we ended up with. Very, very conspicuous. There was also this thing during the war of squadron identification codes. So we go back to those squadron codes, squadron ID stripes that we had during the First World War. During the Second World War, there was a lot more squadrons in operation. The RAF had well over 100 squadrons in operation. So they all needed their own individual identifications. So we ended up with these. These are your standard squadron and aircraft code markings that go on the fuselage of the aircraft. So you've got your standard RAF roundel, and then at the front you have a 2-letter code which identifies your squadron. This one, of course, is 75 Squadron, New Zealand Squadron of the RAF at the time, before we became RNZAF. So AA, and then they would give each aircraft their own individual code letter after the roundel. So that's your individual aircraft ID. Anyone care to hazard which particular aircraft that code is from? Darren, you don't get to answer this. No chalky fish for you.
Wellington?
It's a Wellington.
Ward's Wellington?
Yep, Jimmy Ward's. So this painting here, it's a great one, but they started off at this time with red squadron codes, and then as things progressed, they actually changed those to grey or sky colour. So things were adapting all the time during the war. There was no sort of sedentary period where you had the markings were the same for more than 6 months. They were always making these tweaks to them. There we go, that's OUV. So that's 485 Squadron. Murray Lind at the cockpit there. And that's that aircraft is represented out in the main hall. You've also got your little touches of personalisation there with the New Zealand and the Rongotia. That was where he was from. Then we've got our 2 squadron codes. This aircraft was flying out of Nelson. And once we moved these aircraft up into the Pacific, they would take the squadron codes off. And that was simply from a intelligence point of view. They didn't want the Japanese knowing which squadrons were going where. So once the aircraft would go from the training in New Zealand up into the Pacific Islands, they would paint over those squadron codes. They may, at some stage, some of them had the individual aircraft letters kept on them, but eventually they disappeared as well. There's our Kitty Hawk again. The XO was 16 Squadron, that's flying out of the North Island around Masterton and Gisborne. And then up in the islands we had our big blue-grey Catalinas, and they had a bright yellow code. Double X was 6 Squadron, so XXD there in that picture. And that carried over right into the 50s, early 60s with number 5 Squadron, number 6 Squadron with our Sunderland flying boats and the Catalinas prior to that as well. So they had their KN codes for 5 Squadron and their individual aircraft serial numbers. And then we returned to peacetime. So we come back into peace, and what we did here is we just dropped everything that we'd learned from the Americans and the Pacific. We simply went back to following what the Empire was doing. So all our markings reverted to RAF style markings. The simple red, white, blue roundel, and in this case the large fin flash. And this is a training aircraft, so it has a set size for those training markings in the bright yellow there to make it a bit more visible. And then the 50s hit, and we had the Territorial Air Force. And this was 4 different squadrons across the country: Auckland, Wellington, Canterbury and Otago. And initially started off with just the roundels and fin flashes, and then Squadron Pride started to kick off. So they, I think it was 4 Squadron, they snuck the first one and they painted some diamonds either side of a diamond flash either side of the roundel. And within the week, the other squadrons had caught on to this, and they wanted their own particular markings. So eventually they compromised, and they decided everyone's going to have checkerboards, and they're going to be a set size like this. This is 4 Squadron in Wellington, sorry, 2 Squadron, Wellington with the black and yellow checkers. And that was all written down. It was drawn up on a lovely piece of paper and promulgated. This is the size they should be, but there was a lot of squadron rivalry. So you'd see some aircraft with all those checkers being just slightly bigger. They make them half an inch bigger all round, just that one-upmanship on the other squadrons. But that was sort of the big period of us having very colourful squadron markings on the aircraft like that. And once we got rid of the Mustangs, that sort of died out, and we went back to the standard RAF style stuff. So now we get to the stage we want to cut the apron strings from the Empire and get our own identity. And this became quite heated, the great debate. There was letters to the newspaper. Some of them are very caustic about why we should be following the Brits and why don't we have our own ID. So the great debate was those 2 great Kiwi markings of the silver fern, the Kiwi, or maybe something else. And one of the ideas that was shown was a Southern Cross, so a cross with 4 stars inside the roundel. That one never took off, so the big debate was between the fern and the Kiwi. Ferns, of course, had been used quite a lot by the Kiwis. You saw the one on the Spitfire earlier, the 485 Squadron. This is 486 Squadron's armoury during the European campaign. And I'm pretty sure that fern actually comes from butter. It was a trademark on New Zealand butter at that stage. And 14 Squadron had been up in the Southeast Asia region with the Malay conflict and things like that, and they had been using a Kiwi on the tail of their aircraft. So this big debate was, we're already using these things, they've been used, and the Kiwi was actually the most popular one. Everyone wanted the Kiwi, except for here Vice Marshal Merton, the Chief of Air Staff at that stage. He preferred the fern. And so the fern got the nod. It was rank has its privilege. He decided the fern would be the one we'd go with. Now, initially it was going to be, well, they trialled a silver fern. They painted one up. They compromised and ended up with this white fern. And it's quite easy to see. and if you know what it is, it's quite easy to go, yeah, that's a silver fern. And it's reasonably bright, but there was lots of complaints, especially when they were overseas up in Malaya and places like that, where the British Air Force guys were referring to it as the white feather. And as we know, the white feather was the sign of cowardice. So it wasn't that popular, and the marking itself only lasted a year before they decided they would go to the silver fern. So there's our Devon, Sunderland. So it's a very striking marking, but that white fern really sort of ticked them off a wee bit. So they decided they'd go with the silver fern. Now these are actually decals. They were trialled as a stencil, didn't really work, couldn't get the definition. They ended up having them as decals, so they had to rationalise the amount of different size roundels they had. So some aircraft, like the Hastings and the Sunderland, had huge roundels on the wings, so up to 72 inches. So they decided, well, we can't afford, because these things were horrendously expensive. In the 1980s, a 12-inch decal used to cost about $70. So you compare that to today, it's like, it's the equivalent of $300 or $400. So they wanted hundreds of these things, so they rationalised them. They had samples made, and they changed the size of roundels, either smaller or bigger, so they could buy less of these things. The trouble with these is it's basically a water slide decal like we used to use on our plastic model kits, and they do tend to break down over time, and they would yellow out as well. So the silver would start to turn a sort of bronzy colour with the infrared from the sun. And it got referred to as the paint scratch. Wasn't that easy to discern from a distance. So once again, we were being laughed at, often by our own people, probably a lot by the painters, because we had to deal with these fiddly little decals. So just some examples of that. It's on that Bristol freighter, but it's exceptionally hard to see. There's one on a Canberra. And this is a great example of the contrast between the white and the silver. The Beaver aircraft hanging off the crane there has got a silver fern on it. You can barely see it, whereas the Oster wing still has the big white fern. And there's another one where the decal on that one is actually degraded to the point where most of the black has fallen off it. So that continued, that was 1957 through until the late 60s, and the debate was sort of simmering away all the time, but then it really came into its own in about 1969, where there was a letter to the editor of the paper, the New Zealand Herald I think it was, pretty much slating the use of the silver fern, and why aren't we using the kiwi? Because we were known as Kiwis worldwide. Whenever the Air Force went somewhere, we had, if you've heard of zapping, that's where a foreign aircraft lands at your airfield and you sneak out with a little stencil and a tin of paint, and you quietly paint a little kiwi on the nose undercarriage doors, or the very infamous one where they painted on a RAF Vulcan, they painted over a kiwi over the whole roundel. And so that whole thing of we're Kiwis, why are we still playing with the silver fern? No one can see it, it's a paint scratch. So they'd come up with a kiwi. And this was one of the guys just basically copied the florin, the kiwi off the florin there. That's 20 cents in modern money. And then they developed this. So they were still umming and ahhing. There was a big debate going on. So the guys at Ohaki, I think it was Ross Cleverly, they painted this on a piece of cardboard, and they went out and stuck it on the side of a Dakota, photographed it, and then sent it down to air staff. And that was kind of the big tipping point. Yes, it does look good. It is on backwards on this. The sun was on the wrong side of the aircraft, so they only had one kiwi to stick on it. But that's how we ended up with the kiwi we have today. So they modified that skinny kiwi into something with a bit more body to give a much bigger red blob in the middle of those roundels, make it identifiable. And that's the one we've stuck with for the last 53 years. So we've done pretty well out of that, and it's recognisable around the world. It does have its detractors. It has been called the fat ass chook. But we like it. I love it. I've painted far too many of those. So the first aircraft in New Zealand to get the Kiwi roundel was a C-130 Hercules at Whenuapai. That's Junk Clark on the far right-hand side, Trudy. You don't know Junk? You certainly wouldn't recognise him. This was when he was a young fella. So they had their big Kiwi stencil there. They just get up there, draw it onto the side of the aircraft, mask it out, and then voila, we've got Kiwis on our aircraft for the next 50 years. So there's the Herc with its original red Kiwis on it in its very early silver and white scheme. So they ended up on everything with the Andovers in 1975. They were actually painted up in the UK before they flew out to New Zealand, and on one aircraft the Kiwis were on the wings backwards. So it was still formulating those standardised practices. Just out of interest, the Kiwi should always be facing the front of the aircraft, and when it's on the wings, the feet are always to the fuselage. So that's just our standard way of doing things. And on the wee air trainers, actually go back, those actually were decals. We just stuck a whole decal on the side because they're only little wee ones. Decals were still horrendously expensive in those days, so I don't know why they decided to decal those. And that's how we do our Kiwis. That's in our books to this day, where to position those Kiwis. We actually have metal templates. We've got them in the archive now because today they cheat and they do everything with computer cut frisks, which to me takes longer. But that's the modern way of doing things. We'll do it all with a computer. But we used to draw these on by hand. And when you got down to the little ones, trying to mask out those toes was an absolute nightmare. Hey, Trudy. Led to quite a bit of blue language.
Is there a reason why one leg's not attached?
Yeah, it just gave it some depth. If you join those legs up, it really throws out the perception of the animal. So that was just to give some depth, and it also made it as we could do that as a stencil. So we actually had cardboard stencils and aluminium stencils where for a quick job we could just throw it on the side of things. Now that brings us into the modern world. We've got low visibility markings. So we've gone from our red, white and blue, and in the modern environment you want to be as stealthy as possible, but the odd thing is the more stealthy we are now, the less relevance markings actually have because of the amount of electronic warfare stuff that's available, identification, friend or foe, signals and all that sort of thing. But we went with low visibility marking back in the late 90s, mid-90s. So we ended up with much lower visibility markings across our fleet. This is the time we started painting pretty much all our aeroplanes in that grey colour. There's two reasons for that. Grey is quite stealthy over land and water, and it also helped us out with the helicopters on 3 Squadron, that the media wouldn't constantly call them Army helicopters because they thought that anything that was green was Army. So we went with a Air Force blue grey to sort of get around that issue as well. So our RNZAF Lovers, we started back in the early 90s, and we had a blue and red roundel. We made the Kiwi bigger, took away the white, and came up with this one. And that was on our camouflage C-130s, Skyhawks, and they had a fin flash to match, which was just blue and red with no white. And then this is the one we wanted initially for the Lovers. We suggested this at Woodburn and were shot down, but we went to the black ones. So they then had black on a 3-tone camouflage, which is so much easier to deal with. You didn't have to mask out 2 different colours. And then today we've gone to the lower vis, the light grey one on the other side, that's the Sea Sprites, and the darker grey on this side is on the P3 Orions, Poseidons now, but they were on the Orion as well. So there's our C-130. It may be low vis, but it's still, it's a big red blob. So it took a while for them to sort of get over that one and say, let's just get rid of the red altogether. There's a skyhawk, same thing, big red splodges. And this is what happens when you go too low vis. This was an experiment they did at Ohakia. They took the green paint sheet with all the different green shades on it, and they said, right, we'll have that green for the fuselage, and we'll just take the very next colour on the federal standard colour chart for the markings. And they did this as an experiment, and you couldn't see the markings enough to satisfy that sort of clear and discernible visible marking. So they went, from there they went to just plain black ones, like the aircraft that's out in the hall. So there's our Orion down the hangar with its low vis markings, and that's the P8 fleet with their the big albatross on the tail. We don't have fin flashes anymore because you can't do red, white and blue and black, so they simply just don't bother with fin flashes anymore. But we've got to the stage where we have squadron identifications, still quite important as part of our schemes. These are some low vis from around the world. That's how the US do theirs now. Australia, of course, with the jumping rat. Norway. South Korea, they have some really, really low vis. And of course Canada. And those Canadian and Australian ones, they came to their air forces before we got our Kiwi. So that was another one of those big levers for us to actually get our national identity, was to follow the other empire services into getting your own identity. And then we go into squadron markings. So squadron pride. Everyone likes to support their own squadron, so we had various markings. The red and black Canterbury coloured there for 3 squadron is a throwback to the Territorial Air Force colours. So 3 squadron sticks with their red and black. That's a little Maori warrior, which comes off the 1 shilling coin at that stage, was a 10-cent piece. And that was designed by Ross Cleverley again. So he has stuck with the squadron ever since. We have our squadron badges, which is the one with the crown in the middle there. They're badges, not crests. And they go on to individual aircraft as well to highlight the service squadrons. 75 squadron at top right there with those wartime colours. 5 squadron had that's the original version of their Albatross instead of just the big dark grey one that they have now. It was a full colour one, once again designed by Mr. Ross Cleverley. He was a prolific painter who came up with some really good ideas, and his ideas are hanging through to today. 40 Squadron's big compass rose there is directly off their crest. Those were fun to paint, weren't they, Trudy? Didn't do any of those. They were a 4-colour one. When we did them in the low vis colours, it would take 6 hours just to mask one of those out. We had a big aluminium template. We'd line it up on the aircraft and then draw around it, and it could take 6 hours just to mask those things out. So computer cut, really good in that respect these days as a time saver. And down there is the 2 Squadron's wing taiaha. 2 and 75 Squadron used to have, because they were sharing aircraft at one stage, they used to have a lot of problems with us. They'd bring the aircraft back when it was shifted from 75 to 2 Squadron. They'd come back and get us to paint over the 75 Squadron marking and put the 2 Squadron marking on. And vice versa when it went back the other way. And eventually they decided that this was getting a bit silly because we were repainting these aircraft tails every 3 months or more. So they actually put one either side, 2 Squadron on one side, 75 on the other side of the tail, and said, like it or lump it. So we're not painting anymore. That's 41 Squadron up in Malaya, and they had that was a mission they were on, Operation Scorpion. So they actually added this big red scorpion to their tail. But in those days, the 50s and that, they just had these squadron banners across the tail of the aircraft. So it's a big blue stripe with yellow outlines and then the squadron number in the middle of it. So that was quite common, 40 Squadron, 41 Squadron, all those 1950s ones. There's our Albatross on the tail. The bright scheme for the Skyhawks. That was a fun scheme to paint. That 75 Squadron Tiki marking was actually a series of stencils. We used to do them in cardboard, and there was 9 stencils, different stencils you had to use to create that one marking. And this is, as I said, the arguments over 75, so port and starboard on the tail of the Skyhawk. So the one out there, you'll see one of those markings on the tail. And we still have drawings for all these things, tells you exactly what size the markings should be. So this is out of our early book. Now we get to servicing markings. There's all those little bits and pieces all over the aeroplanes. And some aeroplanes have a lot of these things. There's, on the C-130 from memory, I think there's 163 individual markings on that aircraft. We used to do that in 2 days. We'd do all the markings on a C-130 with a team of 8. So you were running around with cardboard stencils. There'd be, say, 10 of one particular stencil, so you'd run around and run on to the next bit and spray that. So, yeah, lots and lots of markings. I'd hate to count how many are on things like the P-8 Poseidons. They'll have well over, probably closer to 200 markings on that aircraft. But that's these little doohickeys. Anyone care to posit that one? Know what that one is? That's our fuel drain marking. So when we started marking aircraft, it was driven by manufacturers. They would put these markings on them. The Harvard was a good example. They had markings on all the access panels. You know, there'd be aileron cables inside, things like that. So it was all done with lots of words. We just cut stencils in words and painted it onto the aircraft. So we had things like this. First aid kit stowed here. So there's 5 words where a symbol would be so much better. Ground starter socket only, 24 volts. Very, very wordy. Some of them are exceptionally wordy. Do not handle, where you didn't want people to touch things, especially flight controls or sensitive things, indicators and stuff on the aircraft. And things like this. Warning, this aircraft is fitted with an explosively operated ejection seat. So it's an awful lot of words, to be, especially those warning ones, they're in 1-inch letters. So that stencil comes out to about that long. So they thought, we've got to simplify this. And when we started buying American aircraft in the 1960s, the Hercules, Orion, the helicopter fleet, where we had previously been pretty much all English airplanes barring the Harvard, we inadvertently, had to just fall into the use of NATO markings, which the Americans had developed by that stage in consultation with the European powers. So they came up with a NATO set of markings. And they were much simpler. NATO took over. All those words, well, not all of them, some of them you got to keep, but they simplified these things into symbols. So warning, this aircraft is fitted blah, 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 simply became danger, ejection seat. Stick it on the aircraft. You can see it from a long way away. You don't have to, in the dark, walk right up to the airplane to try and read what's on it. So that not only makes things safer for the ground crew, but it just simplifies that whole painting process. So we have things like this. Fuel drain inside became this little fuel drain marking. The star inside that yellow contraption there, looks like a tap, strangely, that actually donates fuel. So that's a fuel drain. Trestle here simply became a little box on legs. Slinging point became a hook. Ground starter socket only 24 volts was simply a big electrical marking with a 24 volt underneath. And then your first aid kit, everyone knows what a first aid kit looks like with a big red cross on it. And our do not handle and things like no step just became a stylised foot or a hand with a cross through it. So that made life a lot simpler, not only for us painters, but if you went to an airfield where their first language wasn't English and you're getting these guys out to service your aircraft, put fuel in it or whatever, you didn't have to rely on a knowledge of the English language for the ground operators to actually identify where things were on the aeroplane. So that just simplified everything and got rid of all those ridiculous words. The Canberra we had here actually had a lot of the the worded markings on it, and because it operated out of RAF Germany, it had every one of those markings, like trestle hair and first aid kit, were all written in German as well. So they had twice the amount of markings on them. So they went with these lovely simplified things. And there's lots of different ones. This is out of the old book, the 2005. And this is just all the different markings we have. And there's been new ones added to that since. So, inspection of batteries simply becomes a little electrical error. So there's lots of those there. Life rafts, you've got your slinging hooks, an anchor for a picketing point where you tie the aircraft down. Made life so much simpler. This is our old book, so it's in black and white. Our new books have this in colour, because we didn't have colour photocopiers in those days. And there's our explosive device one there, the danger one. So you simply put danger on it, and then if it was an explosive canopy, you just put canopy in the middle of it, or ejection seat, whatever. And then we have emergency markings, which up until that time had simply been handles and whatever were painted red. Red's not particularly good under low light conditions, and some people with colour blindness don't see it that well. So we went to this style of doing our emergency markings with yellow and black. So basically, if you're near an aircraft that's got a big yellow and black marking, don't touch it, because something's probably going to either explode or fall off the aircraft, like the entire door, things like that. So that just became the norm for all our emergency markings as well. Lots and lots. My head is full of this stuff all the time, and it blows me away just how much I've learned over the years. But any questions?
Flash had the blue was always at the front.
Blue's always at the front, yep.
And the RAF followed that when they started?
They followed that, and it stayed the same as the French fin flash until about 1925, somewhere around there. So they kept that for quite some time, and eventually someone just said, oh, hey, our roundels reversed, why don't we just turn the fin flash around as well? Yeah. So that was, they were kind of proactive on one side and dragging the chain on the other. Chris?
Hey, Barf, thank you. Hey, you talked a lot about stencils, masking, some of those sort of methods for painting. In the really early versions, I suspect that some of those materials wouldn't have necessarily been available. Would they be
hand painted? Yep. If you have a look at these before you leave.
in the roundels?
Yep. They would hand paint everything, right down to the little component serial numbers. They were hand painted on. So stencils didn't really sort of come along unless you were hand cutting the actual stencils, which there was a lot of that between the wars. Those early World War I days, there was just a lot of people who could sign write. Quite, their hand skills in those days were a lot different. They taught it at school, how to do that sort of stuff. So
to redeem
no.
back to paint. Was there variation?
There was variations in paint. Yeah, that dark brown that's on that one, that's a colour called PA10, and that was a English colour, and that was used on just about every aircraft they had at that time. So there wasn't a lot of variety until the Germans were quite proactive in that, but some of their stuff they had lozenge markings on some of their airframes, and that was actually the fabric was printed before they applied it to the aircraft, whereas the British tended to stay with this sort of browny, dull beige colour on this side. That's bare fabric with varnish over the top, or dope over the top. So the British sort of stuck with that lot. But all those markings are all hand painted, so it's a big hand painted roundel. You get out there with draw around it and then carefully brush it in. So things are a lot easier with stencils, and especially a lot easier with computer cut frisks.
Where do the Italians come into this?
The Italians, they had their own marking, which was quite a complicated. It was their hangover from their fascist days. So I can't remember what it was called, but it was the three fascines. That's it. So their one was actually quite complicated. There was a lot of some services sort of made it too hard on themselves. And if you weren't stenciling that sort of thing, it would take hours, especially those Italian markings. They would take hours to do by hand. The South Africans, when they developed their own marking, because initially they were all on the RAF style, they had their that star fort, which is their blue symbol. So, yeah, there's lots of variations. Predominantly it's roundels that most Air Forces have, because they're easy to do and simply just change the colours. So, yeah, there's a massive variation.
So, when you're doing these sort of roundels, would you have to prepare the area with an undercoat and then a oil-based paint and then a sort of a varnish over the top? Or?
These are done with dopes on these early ones, being fabric aircraft. So that's just a coloured or pigmented dope. For this, it's quite simple because they're solvent-based. So if you wanted to paint over that, and it's been a while before you're painting over the actual wing, you simply give the wing a wipe with some solvent and then paint straight over it, and then that will adhere to the next layer. Modern days with your the modern 2-pack paints, you've got to paint over it within a certain amount of time. So when we used to do the C-130s at Woodburn, we had finished the top coat camouflage colour on one day, and the very next day we would start putting the markings on. So we had to get those markings on basically within 2 days, otherwise you would have to start scuffing the surface and re-preparing it. And the 2-pack paints, because they dry with a hardness system, you can't just wash them with a bit of solvent. You actually have to rough the surface up. So that's why we used to do them, try and get them all done within 2 days. Yeah, and if you don't, things start peeling off at the edges. And I've seen whole stencils just disappear on a test flight, and just have to go back and do it as a rectification before they send it back to the squadron. Yep. Chris?
What is the square you see on particularly World War II aircraft? WT.
WT, yeah. That is... there's still argument over what it actually means. No one can actually pin down what the W and the T mean, but it's where the bonding wires go. So on your wooden aeroplanes, they needed to be bonded right through with copper strips to avoid static discharge. So those mark where those bonding wires are. And one of it's probably the most popular idea of the WT is that it means wired throughout. So they are on where any component joins another, where those bonding strips are actually joined up. Stops the aircraft generating static electricity, and especially with the fabric aeroplanes, you could actually set fire to them if you've got enough static electricity. We'll go to this gentleman first.
Any of the current Arizona fleet still have fabric inspection panels?
No.
C-130s line have fabric covered.
Yeah, they have. There was fabric covering some of the inspection holes inside, like the back of the rudder, the back of the tail fin, not anywhere near the slipstream. So we would simply, initially they were doped on with red dope. By the time I was working on them up at Woodburn, we'd actually just glue the fabric panels on with ADOS and brush another coat over the top and then spray over the top of that.
So just to clarify, it's on the interior of
it's in where the tail fin finishes and the rudder starts, in behind that. So it's not directly in the slipstream, but pretty much all fabric panels are gone off aeroplanes these days. Yeah.
I've always thought it's a bit odd with the 626 with the 80 to full stops that
Yeah, there's
stands out.
there's oddities throughout, and there's publications that say here's a standard way of doing things, and there's so many variations on that standard, and it got during those 50s and 60s eras when we had the territorial Mustangs and that, you could tell the difference between an aircraft that was painted at Wigram and an aircraft that was painted at Ohakea, because Ohakea did the shape of their numbers 7s differently. They had a pointed end on it or a blunt end, one way or the other. So their 7s were recognisable as being done at Ohakea. So those things sort of, even though they're standards, not so much these days because it's all on a computer cut frisk, you can just stick it on, you don't even have to think about it, it comes straight off the computer. But there's those little variations all over the place. Yeah. And to get all these markings in the correct place, for some reason the graphic wouldn't come up. We have a map of each aircraft with all the individual marking points. So you're supposed to get them exactly in the right place. But we used to paint, when we first started painting the C-130s at Woodburn, they'd come from Air New Zealand previously, they were done at Mangere. And one of the aircraft we had, the roundel on top of the wing was actually 6 foot away from where it should have been. Someone had just read the drawing wrong. So it doesn't always work. You know, you can give people as many drawings as you like, but it's still the guy with the pencil up on the aircraft who dictates exactly where it goes. Yeah. Cool. Hope I haven't bored you to tears. Cool. I'm happy.